A prejudiced and biased teacher. A classroom where tension is thick in the air. But there's a twist lurking, one that no one could have predicted. A revelation that will uncover years of hidden bigotry. Get ready for a narrative that will challenge the way you perceive what happens behind closed classroom doors. The bell rang, marking the start of another day at Westfield High. Miss Roberts stood at the helm of her English class, her sharp eyes scanning the students as they shuffled to their seats. The room was cloaked in an atmosphere of discomfort, a familiar weight that always seemed to accompany her lessons. As the last few students trickled in, a new face appeared in the doorway. Jasmine King entered the room, her backpack slung casually over one shoulder. Eyes turned toward her, some curious, others skeptical. Miss Roberts's lips pressed into a thin, almost imperceptible line as she watched Jasmine find an empty desk near the back of the classroom. "Well, well," Miss Roberts began, her tone laced with feigned politeness. "It seems we have a new student joining us today. I trust you'll find our curriculum challenging." The emphasis on challenging was subtle but cutting, a deliberate jab meant to sow doubt. Jasmine, unshaken, met the teacher's gaze with a calm that masked her inner resolve. She didn't respond, letting her silence speak volumes. Miss Roberts turned back to the board, but the energy in the room had already shifted. Something unspoken lingered, like the quiet before a storm. What happens when a teacher's prejudice clashes with a student's quiet but unyielding resilience? The answer lies in Jasmine's next move, a move that could change everything. Miss Roberts cleared her throat, her gaze narrowing as it landed on Jasmine. "Today, we'll be exploring the themes of power and oppression in To Kill a Mockingbird," she announced, her voice cutting through the murmurs of the class. "Who'd like to start?" Her eyes scanned the room, deliberately skipping over Jasmine's raised hand. Student after student was called upon, their answers accepted with varying degrees of approval. Finally, Miss Roberts could no longer ignore Jasmine's persistent presence. With a forced smile, she addressed her. "Yes, Miss King? You have something to add?" Jasmine sat up straighter, her voice steady but tinged with resolve. "I think the novel highlights how systemic racism—" "Systemic racism," Miss Roberts interjected, her voice dripping with mock incredulity. "My dear, you seem to be conflating this literary classic with modern political commentary." A ripple of unease moved through the classroom. Some students shifted uncomfortably, while others exchanged amused smirks, eager for the brewing drama. Jasmine held her ground, her fingers tightening around the edge of her desk. "With all due respect, Miss Roberts, the racial injustice portrayed in the novel is a reflection of—" "That's quite enough," Miss Roberts cut her off again, dismissing her with a wave of her hand. "Perhaps you should focus on understanding the text as it's written, rather than imposing your interpretations." The tension in the room was almost tangible. Jasmine's jaw tightened, her calm facade betraying the frustration simmering beneath the surface. She didn't speak again, but her defiant posture spoke louder than words, unnerving Miss Roberts even more. Turning back to the whiteboard, Miss Roberts continued as if nothing had happened. "Now, let's discuss the true themes the author intended. Can anyone explain the symbolism of the mockingbird?" Her voice was brisk, her back turned to Jasmine as though to erase her presence entirely. Throughout the remainder of the lesson, Miss Roberts deliberately overlooked Jasmine's raised hand, her eyes skimming past her without pause. The message was unmistakable. Jasmine's perspective was not welcome in this space. The other students began to notice. Some exchanged uneasy glances, their discomfort mirroring the growing tension in the room. Others, however, seemed to revel in the teacher's behavior, their smirks directed toward Jasmine like silent taunts. Despite it all, Jasmine remained composed. Her pen moved steadily across the page as she took meticulous notes, a quiet act of defiance that refused to grant Miss Roberts the satisfaction of breaking her spirit. As the class drew to a close, Miss Roberts announced a group project with an air of finality. "I'll be assigning the groups," she declared. "We wouldn't want anyone to feel out of place." Her words hung in the air, heavy with unspoken implications. Jasmine's eyes narrowed slightly, recognizing the subtle provocation for what it was. She squared her shoulders, her silent determination meeting Miss Roberts's unyielding gaze head-on. When the bell finally rang, the students began to file out. Jasmine lingered, gathering her belongings with deliberate care. As she reached the door, Miss Roberts called after her. "Miss King, a word." Jasmine turned, her expression carefully neutral. "Yes, Miss Roberts." The teacher's smile was tight, her tone falsely sweet. "I trust you understand that in this class we prioritize facts and analysis over personal opinions or agendas. I'd hate for you to fall behind because you struggle to separate your feelings from the curriculum." For a moment, Jasmine said nothing. Then, with calm precision, she replied, "I understand perfectly, Miss Roberts. I look forward to demonstrating my analytical skills in the next discussion." With that, she walked out, leaving Miss Roberts standing at her desk, a flicker of uncertainty crossing her face. "Spit it out this instant, young lady," Miss Roberts demanded, her tone soaked in disdain. The classroom stilled, tension thick in the air. Some students shifted in their seats, their eyes glued to their desks, while others glanced at Jasmine with a mix of unease and anticipation. Jasmine rose slowly, her movements measured and deliberate. She walked to the trash can, mimicking the act of spitting out non-existent gum, and then returned to her seat with quiet dignity. The silence that followed was deafening, an unspoken acknowledgement of the power struggle unfolding before them. As the lesson continued, Miss Roberts's behavior escalated, becoming more overt and hostile. She found fault in every aspect of Jasmine's participation, from her handwriting to her posture. "Sit up straight, Miss King. This is a classroom, not your living room," she barked, the criticism ringing hollow as Jasmine's posture was no different from that of her peers. Despite her best efforts to remain composed, Jasmine's frustration was evident in the tightness of her jaw and the way her hand gripped her pen, as though it were the only thing tethering her to her composure. The classroom dynamics began to shift under the weight of Miss Roberts's overt antagonism. Students like Sarah, seated in the front row, cast sympathetic glances at Jasmine whenever the teacher wasn't looking. Others, emboldened by Miss Roberts's attitude, snickered and exchanged whispered comments, their actions feeding the toxic environment. During a group discussion, Jasmine raised her hand to contribute, her voice calm and unwavering. Miss Roberts's lips curved into a cold smile, a predator eyeing its prey. "Yes, Miss King," she said, her voice dripping with mock encouragement. "Do enlighten us with your unique perspective." Jasmine began to speak, her words deliberate and thoughtful, but Miss Roberts interrupted almost immediately. "I'm sorry, but could you enunciate more clearly? Not all of us are familiar with certain dialects." The classroom collectively gasped, the veiled racism now laid bare for all to see. Jasmine's hands clenched into fists beneath her desk, her calm composure slipping under the weight of the blatant insult. When the bell rang to signal the end of class, Miss Roberts called out, "Miss King, stay behind. We need to discuss your performance." Jasmine approached the teacher's desk, her heart pounding but her expression unreadable. Miss Roberts looked up from her papers, her gaze as cold as her voice. "I hope you understand, Miss King, that your attitude is becoming increasingly problematic. If you can't adapt to the standards of this classroom, perhaps it would be best for you to consider a more suitable environment." The words hung in the air, a thinly veiled suggestion that Jasmine didn't belong. Taking a deep breath, Jasmine replied, her tone measured but firm, "I understand perfectly, Miss Roberts. I will continue to do my best, as I always have." As she turned to leave, Miss Roberts added with a smirk, "Oh, and Miss King, don't forget that your group project presentation is due next week. I do hope you're prepared." Jasmine nodded, her mind already racing. She knew the presentation would be a battleground, another opportunity for Miss Roberts to try to humiliate her, but she was determined not to let the teacher's prejudice define her. When the day of the presentation arrived, the tension in the classroom was palpable. Jasmine stepped to the front of the room, her head held high, her voice steady despite the storm brewing beneath the surface. Behind her, a project board displayed a meticulous analysis of To Kill a Mockingbird, with a focus on the themes of racial injustice and moral courage. Jasmine had spent countless hours preparing, determined to present a flawless argument. Miss Roberts sat at her desk, her pen tapping against a grading sheet, her eyes narrowed. The predator was watching, waiting for the perfect moment to pounce. The students shifted uneasily, sensing the tension in the room. Halfway through Jasmine's presentation, she paused to address questions from the class. Miss Roberts's hand shot up instantly. "Miss King," she began, her tone syrupy sweet, "I'm curious about your focus. Don't you think you're overemphasizing certain elements of the novel?" Jasmine's brow furrowed slightly, but her voice remained steady. "I believe the racial themes are central to understanding the book's message. As Harper Lee herself said, I'm well aware of what the author said." Miss Roberts interrupted sharply, "But I'm more interested in why you seem unable to appreciate the broader literary merits beyond your personal biases." Another gasp rippled through the classroom. Jasmine's hands tightened into fists at her sides, her carefully maintained composure beginning to fracture. "I don't believe my analysis is biased, Miss Roberts. I've supported every argument with textual evidence and scholarly sources." Miss Roberts rose from her seat, her chair scraping loudly against the floor. She strode to the front of the room, positioning herself between Jasmine and the rest of the class. "Let me make something clear, Miss King," she said, her voice rising. "This fixation on race is not only misguided, but disruptive to the learning environment. Perhaps at your previous school, such narrow interpretations were acceptable, but here we expect a higher standard of academic rigor." The silence was suffocating. Some students stared at their desks, unwilling to meet Jasmine's eyes. Others watched, their expressions a mixture of horror and fascination. "And furthermore," Miss Roberts continued, her voice escalating, "your insistence on injecting modern political agendas into classic literature demonstrates a fundamental misunderstanding of the text. I'm beginning to question whether you're capable of handling this curriculum." Jasmine's eyes shimmered with unshed tears, but she refused to back down. "Miss Roberts, I respectfully disagree. The themes of racial injustice in To Kill a Mockingbird are as relevant today as they were when the book was written. Ignoring them does a disservice to the author's intent and to the students in this classroom." "Enough!" Miss Roberts snapped. "Your attitude is bordering on insubordination. Take your seat and reflect on whether you're truly prepared for this level of academic discourse." As Jasmine gathered her materials, the weight of humiliation pressing heavily on her, a small voice from the back of the room broke the silence. "But I thought Jasmine's presentation was really good." Miss Roberts whirled around, her eyes blazing with indignation. "And what would you know about literary analysis, Mr. Peterson? Perhaps you'd like to join Miss King in detention to discuss your own academic deficiencies," she snapped. The boy shrank back into his seat, silenced and humiliated. With a sharp turn, Miss Roberts returned her gaze to Jasmine, who stood frozen by her desk, a storm of emotions brewing inside her. "Well, what are you waiting for? Sit down so we can move on to presentations that are actually worth our time." Jasmine lowered herself into her chair, her face flushed with a mixture of anger and shame. She could feel the weight of her classmates' stares, some filled with quiet sympathy, others glinting with cruel amusement. The injustice of it all threatened to overwhelm her, but she fought to steady her breathing, taking slow, deliberate inhales and exhales. As Miss Roberts called the next student to present, Jasmine's thoughts raced. She couldn't let this go on. But what could she do? The teacher wielded all the authority, and standing up to her now would only invite more public humiliation. For the moment, she would have to endure. But deep within her, a quiet, steely resolve began to take shape. This wasn't over. As Jasmine grappled with her emotions, fate decided to intervene in a way no one could have predicted. The classroom door creaked open, and Miss Roberts looked up with an almost gleeful expression, as if she'd been anticipating an interruption she could control. "Class, I have an important announcement," she declared, her voice sickly sweet with a veneer of authority. "I've decided it's time for a parent-teacher conference regarding Miss King's performance." Jasmine's heart raced, her emotions an unsteady mix of anxiety and defiance. She knew her father would defend her, but the thought of him confronting Miss Roberts sent a ripple of unease through her. Around her, classmates exchanged glances, some wide-eyed with concern, others barely masking their curiosity about the drama that was sure to unfold. "I've arranged a meeting with Miss King's parents after school," Miss Roberts continued, her tone laced with satisfaction. "I'm sure they'll be very interested in hearing about her disruptive behavior and, frankly, subpar academic performance." Her words hung in the air like a gavel pounding down on a sentence. But before the class could fully absorb her declaration, the rhythmic sound of footsteps echoed from the hallway. The noise grew louder, more purposeful, with each passing second. The class collectively held its breath, sensing that something monumental was about to happen. The footsteps stopped just outside the door, a pause pregnant with tension, before a firm knock shattered the silence. Miss Roberts's brow furrowed slightly, irritation flickering across her face at the interruption. "Come in," she called, her voice tight with impatience. The door swung open, and a tall man in a tailored suit stepped into the room. His presence was commanding, his sharp features and poised demeanor instantly drawing every pair of eyes. A ripple of recognition coursed through the students as they realized who he was: Mr. King, the school principal. Jasmine's eyes widened, surprise and relief flooding her simultaneously. She glanced toward Miss Roberts, who seemed blissfully unaware of the relationship between her student and the man who had just entered. Mr. King's gaze swept over the room, briefly pausing on Jasmine. There was a flicker of understanding and concern in his expression, a silent message that didn't go unnoticed by his daughter. Turning his attention back to Miss Roberts, he addressed her in a calm, steady voice. "Miss Roberts, I hope I'm not interrupting anything important." Miss Roberts straightened, her professional mask snapping into place as she greeted him with a polished smile. "Not at all, Mr. King. We were just finishing up a lesson on To Kill a Mockingbird. Is there something I can assist you with?" Mr. King nodded slightly, his eyes locked on the teacher. "Actually, there is. I understand you've requested a parent-teacher conference regarding one of your students." Miss Roberts's smile widened, clearly pleased by what she interpreted as a validation of her authority. "Yes, that's correct. I felt it was important to address certain issues before they escalate further." "I see," Mr. King replied evenly. "And which student might this concern?" Without hesitation, Miss Roberts gestured dismissively toward Jasmine. "Miss King," she said, a faint smirk curling her lips. "No relation to you, of course." She chuckled lightly at her own joke, the casual bigotry of her words landing heavily in the room. For a brief moment, Mr. King's eyebrow arched, a subtle but telling reaction. His voice remained steady as he replied, "Is that so? Well, Miss Roberts, I think this is a conversation best held in private." Miss Roberts nodded enthusiastically, clearly envisioning the support she expected to receive. "Of course, Mr. King. I'd be more than happy to share my concerns regarding Miss King's performance and, frankly, her attitude." Turning to the students, Mr. King addressed the class with measured authority. "Please continue with your assigned reading. We'll just be a moment." Then he glanced at Jasmine, offering a brief but reassuring smile. It was a subtle gesture, but one that infused her with a sense of strength and vindication she hadn't felt in weeks. Jasmine sat up straighter, her resolve now unshakable. Miss Roberts, still blissfully unaware of the full context, led the way out of the classroom with a confident stride. Mr. King followed close behind, pausing at the doorway to exchange one final look with his daughter. In that moment, a silent understanding passed between them, one of solidarity and shared determination. As the door clicked shut behind them, the room buzzed with hushed whispers. Students leaned across desks, speculating about what was unfolding in the hallway. Jasmine remained still, her eyes fixed on the door. Beyond it, she knew justice was finally being set in motion. Outside, the voices grew louder. Though muffled by the walls, the class could hear the shift in tone as Miss Roberts's confidence gave way to uncertain stammering. Mr. King's calm authority filled the air like an unstoppable tide, dismantling her defenses piece by piece. How would Miss Roberts's attitude shift when the full truth of Jasmine's identity was revealed? The balance of power was finally tipping, and everyone in the classroom could sense that the reckoning had begun. "I've been deeply concerned about Jasmine's performance and attitude in my class," Miss Roberts began, her voice tinged with self-righteousness. Mr. King listened intently, his expression neutral, but his eyes sharp. "I see. Please elaborate on your concerns," he replied evenly, his calm tone encouraging her to continue. Miss Roberts launched into her complaints, her gestures growing increasingly animated as she spoke. "For starters, she constantly challenges the curriculum. She insists on injecting her personal views into discussions, completely derailing the lessons I've meticulously planned." Mr. King's gaze narrowed almost imperceptibly, but he remained silent, allowing her to finish her tirade. "And her attitude!" Miss Roberts exclaimed, throwing her hands up in frustration. "She's disruptive, always interjecting with her unique perspectives. Just today, she presented a project on To Kill a Mockingbird that completely missed the point, focusing only on racial themes while ignoring the broader literary merits." Mr. King raised a single eyebrow, his voice measured. "And you believe that focusing on racial themes is inappropriate for discussing a novel centered around a racially charged trial?" Miss Roberts faltered momentarily, caught off guard by the question. "Well, I believe we should focus on the universal themes," she stammered, "and not get bogged down in specific issues." "I see," Mr. King said, his tone steady. "Can you provide specific examples of how Jasmine has been disruptive?" Straightening her posture, Miss Roberts regained some of her earlier confidence. "Of course! She constantly raises her hand to challenge my points, argues with other students during discussions, and even her body language. She sits there with this defiant air. It's clear she has no respect for authority." Mr. Sertentwood King's expression hardened, a subtle but unmistakable shift in his demeanor. When he spoke, his voice carried a quiet intensity. "Miss Roberts, have you considered that what you perceive as defiance might, in fact, be a student demonstrating critical thinking?" Miss Roberts blinked, clearly unprepared for the question. Well, I hadn't thought of it that way," she admitted reluctantly. "But Mr. King, you have to understand. This girl simply doesn't fit in here. Her previous education must have been lacking. Perhaps she'd be better suited to a different environment." A muscle tightened in Mr. King's jaw, but his voice remained composed. "And what exactly makes you believe Jasmine's previous education was inadequate?" "It's obvious, isn't it?" Miss Roberts replied, her tone laced with condescension. "The way she speaks, her fixation on certain topics. It's clear she hasn't been exposed to the level of rigor we demand here." Mr. King inhaled deeply, his calm demeanor concealing the storm brewing beneath the surface. "Miss Roberts, I think it's time I clarified something for you. Jasmine's previous education was exemplary. In fact, I can personally vouch for it." Confusion flickered across Miss Roberts's face. "I don't understand. How could you possibly know that?" Mr. King's gaze locked onto hers, unwavering. "I know, because Jasmine King is my daughter." The color drained from Miss Roberts's face as the weight of his words struck her. Her mouth opened and closed, but no sound emerged. The smug confidence she'd carried through the conversation dissolved in an instant. "You're—" she stammered, her voice barely above a whisper. "You're her father?" Mr. King nodded, his expression grim. "Yes, Miss Roberts. Jasmine King is my daughter, and I've been listening very carefully to everything you've said about her." Miss Roberts stumbled back a step, her hand gripping the edge of a desk for support. The realization of her words, the prejudices she'd unwittingly exposed, descended on her like a tidal wave. "Mr. King, I had no idea," she stammered. "I never meant to—" "Clearly," Mr. King interrupted, his tone sharp enough to make her flinch. "But ignorance is no excuse for the behavior you've demonstrated. You've revealed not only a bias against my daughter, but also a troubling pattern of discrimination that likely extends beyond her." Desperation flickered in Miss Roberts's eyes, as she searched for a way to salvage the situation. "Mr. King, please, let me explain." "I didn't mean—" He raised a hand, cutting her off. "You've explained quite enough, Miss Roberts. We'll have a much longer discussion about this later. For now, I suggest you return to the classroom. I'm sure the students are waiting." Miss Roberts nodded numbly and turned toward the door. "Oh, and Miss Roberts," Mr. King added, his tone cold and precise. "I'll be sitting in on your class for the remainder of the day. I'm very interested in observing your teaching methods firsthand." As they re-entered the classroom, the atmosphere shifted palpably. The students sat up straighter, the tension between the two adults crackling in the air. Mr. King addressed the room, his voice calm but commanding. "Class, I believe it's time we had an important discussion about respect, diversity, and the true purpose of education." Miss Roberts stood stiffly by her desk, her earlier confidence reduced to ashes. She glanced nervously between Mr. King and Jasmine, her mind racing to process what had just unfolded. "It has come to my attention," Mr. King continued, his eyes sweeping across the room, "that there have been incidents in this class that run counter to everything this school stands for." The students exchanged wide-eyed glances, the pieces of the puzzle falling into place. "Miss Roberts," Mr. King said, turning toward her, his voice steely, "would you care to explain to the class why you felt it necessary to undermine and belittle one of your students?" Miss Roberts opened her mouth, but no words came. I never meant to." "Never meant to what, Miss Roberts?" Mr. King's voice rose slightly, the carefully restrained frustration evident now. "Ignore her contributions? Stifle her voice? Teach this class that prejudice has a place in our school?" The room was silent, every pair of eyes locked on the unfolding scene. Jasmine sat straighter, the faintest glimmer of hope flickering in her expression as justice finally began to take shape. "Never meant to make racist assumptions about a student's background, never meant to dismiss valid interpretations of literature simply because they didn't align with your narrow worldview." Mr. King's words, sharp and deliberate, sliced through the stunned silence of the classroom. The usually composed and diplomatic principal had transformed before the students' eyes into a fierce advocate for justice. Every syllable laid bare the injustices that had been simmering beneath the surface for weeks. "Let me be perfectly clear," Mr. King continued, his piercing gaze fixed on Miss Roberts. "Your behavior toward Jasmine, and, I suspect, toward other students of color, is not only unprofessional, but deeply harmful. You have cultivated an environment where students feel unsafe expressing their thoughts, experiences, and identities." Miss Roberts's attempt to interrupt was shaky, her voice trembling. "Mr. King, please, if I could just explain." "Explain what, exactly?" Mr. King's patience was clearly wearing thin, his voice cutting through her feeble protests. "Explain how you mocked Jasmine's analysis of To Kill a Mockingbird because it focused on racial themes. Explain how you consistently ignored her raised hand in discussions. Or perhaps you'd like to explain your comment about her previous education being lacking, an assumption rooted entirely in her own prejudice." Miss Roberts visibly paled, her face devoid of its usual smug confidence. Her eyes darted around the room, searching for support among her students, but all she found were shocked and disappointed faces staring back. Mr. King turned his attention to the students. "Listen closely," he said, his voice steady and resolute. "Education is not about silencing voices or dismissing perspectives that challenge our own. It's about expanding our understanding, engaging in respectful dialogue, and learning from diverse experiences. What you've witnessed here is not education. It is discrimination. Plain and simple. And it stops today." The air in the room was thick with emotion. Some students shifted uncomfortably, guilt creeping into their expressions as they reflected on their silence. Others nodded in agreement, their faces illuminated with relief and validation. Jasmine sat quietly, her hands clasped tightly together, her eyes shimmering with tears she refused to let fall. This was her moment of vindication, a hard-fought acknowledgement of her strength and resilience. "Mr. King's gaze returned to Miss Roberts, his tone now icy with finality. "Your actions reveal a disturbing pattern of bias and discrimination that extends beyond this one incident. This behavior is unacceptable, and it will be addressed through the proper channels. For now, I will be taking over this class for the remainder of the day." Miss Roberts stumbled as she gathered her belongings, her movements jerky and uncoordinated. She clutched her bag to her chest like a shield, casting one last desperate look around the classroom, but the message was clear. She was on her own. As she hurried out the door, the silence left in her wake was deafening. Mr. King took a deep breath, visibly working to steady himself before addressing the class again. "I want to apologize," he began, his voice softer now, "that you've had to witness and endure this. Prejudice and discrimination have no place in our school or in our society. It is my responsibility to ensure this institution lives up to the values it claims to uphold." He moved to the front of the room, his posture easing slightly as he continued. "We will be bringing in counselors to help process what has happened here. I encourage all of you to reflect on this experience and consider how we can work together to create a more inclusive, supportive environment for everyone." As the students began to file out, many paused by Jasmine's desk, offering quiet words of support. Sarah, who had sat silently in the front row for weeks, approached hesitantly. "I'm so sorry," she said, her voice barely audible. "I should have spoken up. I knew it wasn't right, but I was scared. It won't happen again." Jasmine offered a small, understanding smile. "Thank you, Sarah. Speaking up is hard, but it's the only way we make things better." Outside the classroom, word of what had transpired spread like wildfire. Students gathered in hushed groups, recounting the confrontation with a mix of awe and disbelief. When Jasmine emerged into the hallway, flanked by her father, a hush fell over the crowd. Then, as if by unspoken agreement, applause broke out. It began tentatively, with just a few students, but quickly grew until it echoed down the corridor. Jasmine walked tall, her head held high. The weeks of fear and isolation melted away, replaced by a powerful sense of belonging and empowerment. For the first time, she felt truly seen, not just by her peers, but by the entire school community. Meanwhile, in the administrative office, Miss Roberts faced the full weight of her actions. The school board convened an emergency meeting, and by the end of the day, the decision was unanimous. As the final bell rang, signaling the close of the school day, Miss Roberts was escorted from the building, a cardboard box of personal items clutched to her chest. Students watched from windows and doorways as she made her way to her car. Her career in education effectively over. There was no satisfaction in the scene, only a somber recognition that actions have consequences. The next morning, Jasmine entered the school to a noticeable shift in atmosphere. Students who had previously avoided her now greeted her with friendly smiles and waves. Conversations in the hallways buzzed with ideas for promoting diversity and inclusion, from expanding the curriculum to creating a cultural awareness club. As Jasmine stepped into her English classroom, now temporarily led by a substitute teacher, she was met with a sea of supportive faces. The tension that had suffocated the room for weeks was gone, replaced by a shared sense of openness and respect. During lunch, Jasmine found herself surrounded by classmates eager to hear her thoughts. Ideas flowed freely. Mentorship programs, student-led initiatives, and plans for workshops celebrating diversity. For the first time, Jasmine felt truly heard and valued. As she left the school that day with her father, they passed by the empty parking spot that once belonged to Miss Roberts. Mr. King placed a gentle hand on his daughter's shoulder, a quiet acknowledgement of her courage. "You know," he said, his voice warm with pride, "you've done more than just stand up for yourself. You've changed this school for the better." Jasmine smiled, the weight of the past weeks lifting from her shoulders. "I didn't do it alone," she replied, "and there's still more to do." Together, they walked toward a future that felt brighter, their shared resolve stronger than ever. "Jasmine," Mr. King said, his voice steady but filled with emotion. What happened here today isn't just about one teacher or one classroom. It's a testament to how change can happen when someone has the courage to speak out and stand firm against injustice. Jasmine nodded slowly, her expression thoughtful but resolute. I just hope it doesn't end here, she replied, her voice quiet yet determined. There are so many others who face this kind of discrimination every day, at school, at work, everywhere. It's not enough to fix one situation if we ignore the rest. The events at Westfield High became more than just a classroom incident. They were a mirror, reflecting the deep-seated prejudices that had long gone unnoticed or ignored. Miss Roberts's treatment of Jasmine exposed biases that had been allowed to fester in an institution meant to be a beacon of learning and fairness. But Jasmine's refusal to be silenced was the spark that ignited a wave of change. The school community responded with a newfound commitment to creating a more inclusive and equitable environment. New initiatives were launched to address diversity and representation. Mandatory training sessions for teachers and staff encouraged them to confront their own biases and blind spots. Open forums gave students a safe space to share their experiences and perspectives, fostering a dialogue that was both challenging and transformative. Jasmine's journey, from a student subjected to prejudice to a leader inspiring change, became a symbol of resilience. Her ability to turn personal pain into a catalyst for progress resonated far beyond the walls of her classroom. Students who had once been bystanders began to examine their own roles in perpetuating or challenging injustice. Teachers, too, were forced to reevaluate their assumptions and practices, recognizing the subtle ways in which bias could manifest and harm. More importantly, Jasmine's courage inspired others to believe in the possibility of change. She showed her peers that standing up to injustice wasn't just about individual strength, it was about creating a ripple effect, empowering others to join in the fight for fairness and equality. As Westfield High moved forward, the lessons learned from Jasmine's experience echoed in every hallway and classroom. Students and staff worked together to build a culture that celebrated diversity and embraced the challenging but necessary work of self-reflection and growth. For Jasmine, the journey was far from over. "This is just the beginning," she told her father one evening as they reflected on how much had changed in such a short time. "There's still so much to do, but at least now I know we're not alone in this." And she wasn't. Jasmine's story had sparked a movement within her school, one that had the potential to spread far beyond its walls. Her resilience, her voice, and her unwavering belief in the power of truth had shown everyone that even in the face of prejudice, change is possible, and that sometimes all it takes is one brave person to start it.